Hello YouTube. Today we're going to talk about selective abortion, focusing on the abortion of fetuses that are found to have physical or mental disabilities. These days there are various tests available during pregnancy to detect disabilities such as Down syndrome, spina bifida, cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia and so on. And many abortions are performed as a result of this. Now, abortion in general is one of the most divisive ethical issues in the modern world. But it seems that most people agree that aborting a disabled fetus is legitimate, or at least is more acceptable than aborting a normal fetus. Many people who would consider themselves pro-life make an exception for cases where the fetus is diagnosed with a disability. However, a number of philosophers have raised objections to this practice. Now, I should note that from my reading of the literature, many of the philosophers who argue that selective abortion is ethically questionable are actually pro-choice. So the claim is that women should be legally permitted to abort a fetus because it has, say, Down syndrome, but that doing so is morally wrong. This is not something that should be encouraged. We should be more critical of the increasing use of prenatal testing and selective abortion. But the arguments are fundamentally concerned with the sort of moral problem. They're not arguing that it should be illegal. So let's consider some arguments against selective abortion. A first argument is what we might call the misinformation argument. The assumptions driving selective abortion are often that if a child has a disability, this means a significantly reduced quality of life for the child and for the family as a whole. So as a result of the disability, the child will experience pain and suffering. It will be unable to find employment when it grows up. It will not have such good social relations. It may not develop intellectually. Basically, disabilities such as Down syndrome and cystic fibrosis will cause a massively reduced quality of life for the child. Furthermore, the disability has serious consequences for the family. Raising a disabled child will require much more time, effort, money, and it will have fewer rewards than raising a normal child. A disabled child will place far more stress on the family. Parents with disabled children are likely to be overworked, they're more likely to break up. So all of these things then make it reasonable to abort a disabled fetus and try again for a new child that's healthy and that will have a good quality of life and that won't badly affect the family. Now, the objection from disability rights activists is that these assumptions are simply false, or at least they're massively overstated. So I guess we might sort of formalise the argument like this. Premise one, the decision to abort should be made with an accurate understanding of the relevant facts. So the point here is that abortion is a substantial decision. I know that some pro-choicers will often say that abortion is just another medical operation or whatever, the fetus is just a clump of cells. I think that's kind of simple-minded, and certainly with respect to selective abortion, you have to bear in mind that most of these mothers will have developed some sort of attachment to the fetus. They will initially have wanted it, right? So they initially want the fetus, and it's only when it's discovered that it has a disability that it's aborted. So this is a substantial decision, right? It's not an easy decision, and there are real moral questions here. And so the point of this premise is that when we make these big decisions, we should do so on the basis of accurate understanding. But premise two, most disabilities are not nearly as bad as many people assume. So selective abortions on the basis of disability are usually morally problematic. So consider, first of all, the child with the disability. The simple fact is that many people with disabilities, sometimes quite serious disabilities, don't regard it as reducing their quality of life. Indeed, there are some individuals who almost kind of celebrate their disability. They may view it as an important part of their identity. They may view it as something that actually, in some respects, improves their life. Surveys of disabled people find that they're about as happy and satisfied with their lives as non-disabled people. Even people with very severe disabilities are often fairly content. And people who were healthy and then became disabled later in life usually don't report any significant reduction in their quality of life. See, for example, the paper The Disability Paradox by Albrecht and Devliger. Or just go on Google and type in disability, quality of life, and you'll find plenty of references here. In general, disabled people don't seem to have a reduced quality of life, at least based on their subjective assessment, which I suppose is the only assessment that we can really go by. You have to take people at their word. So what about harm to the family? Well, again, the empirical evidence suggests that families with disabled children are not significantly less content or less able to cope with crises or more likely to break up than non-disabled families. See, for example, The Experience of Disability in Families by Philip Ferguson and colleagues. Now, of course, there's no doubt that disability will raise additional difficulties and additional stress for any family, but it's important to bear in mind that there are many things that can cause stress. I don't recall the exact article here, but I think it was Adrian Ash who pointed out that having an especially gifted child can pose quite significant difficulties. If your child is brilliantly intelligent, let's say it's like at a genius level, then you'll probably feel under additional pressure to provide her with expensive private education, for example, or she may need to go travelling around the country. I mean, consider children who are like musical prodigies. You'll want to set them up with the best music tutors. You will want to encourage them to go out and play in concerts and things like that. Now, this is a significant source of stress that normal families don't have to deal with. If you have a normal child, these are just things you're not going to have to think about. So, yes, there are additional difficulties that are caused by disability, but disability isn't the only thing that can cause difficulties. And in fact, a disabled child has many positive characteristics as well, so it can be rewarding. So the point is just that actually when we look at what disabled people say about their own lives, and when we look at the families with disabled children, we really don't see that it's really that bad. It's not nearly as bad as people think it will be. So it's very questionable then when people say abort a fetus because it has, for instance, Down syndrome. Arguably, many of them are doing so on the basis of just misinformation, and so it's questionable for that reason. Another argument that is sometimes made to defend selective abortion is the costs to society of disabled children. So disabled children cost more to society as a whole. They put a strain on public services, which in many countries are already underfunded. They will require special medical care, special requirements at school. Later in life, they'll be less productive than non-disabled people. They will work less, and they may require support from government welfare. So the point here is that, okay, well, even if the family is happy to have a disabled child, and even if the disabled child itself is happy, it's still kind of selfish to have a disabled child, because you're creating someone who is going to put a strain on services that are already underfunded. And now, that may be true, but I think this argument is, it seems a bit hollow, given that in present circumstances, having any child is kind of selfish. Yeah, we have problems with overpopulation. There are serious strains on our planet's resources in general, and any child will contribute to that. But I think another point to bear in mind here is that, arguably disability actually makes important contributions to society. So, it may be true that disabled people are, in general, less economically productive than the healthy population, but economic productivity is not the only metric by which to measure success. Disabled people may offer different ways of seeing the world. They may have different perspectives. They may kind of develop new skills that normal people wouldn't think to develop. Many philosophers, perhaps most famously John Stuart Mill, have argued that diversity is valuable. Right, this is one of the reasons why we should preserve free speech and free expression and so on, because it's worthwhile to encourage diversity of new ideas, right? A kind of proliferation of different ideas. Now, disability may be valuable for a similar reason, yeah? So consider blindness. Well, since blind people don't rely on sight, they increase the power of their other senses. Some even develop the ability to echolocate by making clicking sounds with their mouths and hearing the subtle variations in the echoes of the clicks. Look up human echolocation, it's a fascinating skill. Now, a blind person can offer a very different perspective on the world than what any normal person has. And arguably that's something very worthwhile, right? For the same kind of reason that encouraging freedom of speech and diversity of ideas is worthwhile. So to say that disabled people impose greater costs on society seems to imply a kind of quite narrow-minded view of what constitutes social success. So, arguably disability is not so bad, not as bad as people perhaps think it is. Now, of course, one point that obviously needs to be made here is that some disabilities genuinely are just awful. Tay-Sachs disease, Lesch-Nyhan syndrome, these are diseases that condemn the child to a short and painful life, no matter what way you look at it. But the fact is that these severe diseases are relatively rare. The majority of selective abortions are performed due to disabilities like Down syndrome. Down syndrome may be a handicap, but is it really such a big problem? Arguably not. So that's one argument there. A second argument, and probably the most prominent argument forwarded by the disability rights movement, is the expressivist argument. This claims that to abort a fetus purely because it has a disability expresses discriminatory attitudes towards the people living with that disability. I think it was Susan Wendell who said that it sends a message of, we don't want any more people like you, or perhaps a message of, people like you are unworthy of being born. Selective abortion it reinforces the sort of assumptions that people with disabilities are unwanted in society, and that it's better just not to exist than to have a disability. And these are very discriminatory sort of attitudes. So take a pregnant woman who cares very much about her child. She's planned the pregnancy carefully. She's getting the house ready for a new person, buying toys and clothes and all that. So she wants this child, but then she gets it tested. It turns out it has a disability. If she decides to abort on this basis, then it looks like she's assuming that all that matters is the disability. The disability just kind of bulldozes all the other potentially positive characteristics of the child. So the thought is that the selective abortion reduces disabled people to a single trait, their disability, and it just ignores everything else, and it assumes that this single trait is uniformly bad. As Adrienne Ash says, she says, with prenatal diagnosis, a single trait stands in for the whole. The trait obliterates the whole. Adrienne Ash draws on the any particular distinction to clarify the expressivist argument. The claim is that there's a difference between aborting just any fetus and aborting a particular fetus that has a disability. To illustrate, suppose a woman is 20 years old, still in university, she hasn't got a steady career or anything, and she feels that she isn't ready for a child. She gets pregnant and aborts. Now, that this woman would abort any fetus. It doesn't matter what its traits are. She simply doesn't want a child at all. So she would abort any fetus, no matter what it was like. Now, Ash says, this is fine, right? This doesn't send any message at all, because she just doesn't want a child at this point in time. On the other hand, if a woman wants to get pregnant and initially accepts the pregnancy, but she then discovers the fetus has Down syndrome and so decides to abort, she's aborting this fetus because of one single trait. And this is a problem, right? Most abortions are motivated by the desire not to have any baby. Selective abortions are motivated by the desire not to have this particular baby, because this particular baby has a disability. So whereas aborting any fetus doesn't express anything, aborting a particular fetus, because it has this particular trait, expresses a discriminatory attitude towards those with that trait, or so the expressivist argument suggests. Right, let's consider some objections. Well, first of all, it's not clear that the any particular distinction is really coherent. This objection has been made by James Nelson in his article, The Meaning of the Act. Consider again the young woman who feels that she isn't yet ready to have a child. Well, why shouldn't we say that her decision to abort sends a discriminatory message to young mothers? After all, young mothers are quite often looked down on, at least where I am. It's generally considered better to wait and have a child when you're a bit older than to do it when you're still a teenager or in your early 20s. I mean, the point is that the woman is not aborting just any fetus. She's aborting this particular fetus that happened to have been conceived while the mother was young. Similarly, suppose that a couple already have 3 children, the wife gets pregnant, they decide to abort because they feel that 3 is enough. Well, it would be rather silly to think that this sends a discriminatory message to families with 4 children or to fourth-born children. That it tells fourth-born children, hey, society doesn't want any more fourth-borns like you. But again, they're not aborting just any fetus, they're aborting this particular fetus because it has the property of being the fourth-born child. So notice that also that in both these cases, the parents let one particular trait stand in for the whole person, merely because the child was conceived while the mother was too young, merely because the child would be the fourth-born. The parents, in these examples, ignore every other trait. They ignore the many positive characteristics about the child and abort it just because of this one bad thing. A response to this from Nancy Press in her article Assessing the Expressive Character of Prenatal Testing is that we have to bear in mind the distinction between intrinsic properties and merely relational properties. The property of being the fourth-born child is merely relational. It's a matter of how many people happen to have been born before you. If you imagine that one of those people had failed to be born, then you would no longer be the fourth-born. On the other hand, a disorder like Down syndrome is intrinsic. It doesn't depend on any external factors. You can alter the facts about the external world however you want, you'll still have the disability because it's a kind of intrinsic biological property. Now, a first point here is that even if this point is correct, it's not clear to me why it's morally relevant. I mean, why does it matter whether an abortion is based on an intrinsic or a relational property? Why does the fact that being fourth-born is a relational property mean that aborting a fourth-born fetus doesn't send a discriminatory message? I mean, after all, nothing stops a person having discriminatory attitudes towards fourth-born children. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, but then a lot of discrimination doesn't make much sense. Discrimination towards other races doesn't make much sense either, but that's unfortunately popular. So it's not really clear to me how this response actually addresses the objection. In any case, it's actually questionable whether disability really is an intrinsic property. Most disability rights activists accept a social constructivist model of disability, where disability isn't a purely biological problem, but instead it results from the fact that our society has been structured so as to exclude certain types of body. If you have an accident and lose your legs, obviously there's a biological difference between you and other people. But whether this difference disables you is a matter of the equipment available to you and the social environment. So let's say that you are provided with a wheelchair, and then suppose that all buildings and all public transport and so on are wheelchair accessible. Well, in that case, you wouldn't have any problems getting around. You wouldn't actually be disabled anymore, right? You would just have an alternative means of mobility, but you wouldn't have any kind of handicap. You wouldn't be disabled because the social environment would be structured so that everywhere is accessible to you, or at least it's just as accessible to you as it is to anybody who can walk. I mean, another example of this is the deaf, right? Many deaf people have organised themselves into communities that are structured so that the lack of hearing is not a handicap in any way. I mean, all of us lack various abilities, right? None of us are able to fly without a substantial amount of mechanical aid. Now, that isn't a problem because our societies are built with the implicit assumption that people walk, they don't fly. My inability to fly doesn't in any respect handicap me. Well, similarly, deaf people lack the ability to hear. This is a problem in mainstream society because all of our social institutions are built on the assumption that people can hear each other. But in a deaf community, lack of hearing is the norm, and sign language is the normal language. So in a deaf community, deafness isn't a disability at all. Right? It's not like other people in that community have to go out of their way to accommodate your deafness. Deafness is just the norm, and that's the whole community is built with that just assumption of deafness in mind. if a person who could hear but who couldn't speak sign language was to go to a deaf community, they would be disabled. They wouldn't be able to get around that they wouldn't be able to sort of interact with that community in a kind of rich way. They would have lack of opportunity as a result of their inability to speak sign language. So the point is then it's questionable whether disability actually is intrinsic. Arguably, in most cases, the particular disorder is intrinsic. So Down syndrome is an intrinsic property. Or having no legs, that's intrinsic. But whether or not Down syndrome or having no legs disables the individual depends on the wider social structure, and hence is a relational property. You might want to check out my video called Philosophy of Medicine, What is Disease, where I discuss this sort of question of whether disabilities are biological or socially constructed in a bit more detail. So, a second objection to the expressivist argument is that abortion is not really the kind of act that can express such meanings. Again, this objection comes from James Nelson. Nelson's argument is that the expression of meaning requires a public symbol system with reasonably clear rules of usage. The obvious example is something like language, right? Language is a public system. It has very strict rules of grammar and semantics, of sort of meaning and use. Language isn't the only symbol system. Nelson considers the example of flying a Confederate flag on government property. A lot of people find this offensive. They think that it expresses negative attitudes towards black people. Now, in this case, right, this is plausible. It's plausible that flying a Confederate flag is racist because flags are part of a public symbol system. They're not just pretty pictures, right? We all understand flags as expressive of meaning, and we sort of all have this understanding that flags are symbols of particular collectives with particular goals. So with no other context, we can reasonably take flying a flag as expressing admiration or support for the collective that the flag represents. That's in general what flags are used to do. We fly flags in order to express support or identification with a particular collective. And so flying the Confederate flag expresses admiration or support for the Confederacy, which historically is associated with the defence of slavery. And slavery, at least in the context of the United States, victimised primarily African Americans. So with all of this in mind, we can conclude that flying the Confederate flag expresses a contempt for African Americans. It kind of expresses racism. And that's the case even if nobody involved in hoisting the flag had any racist meanings in mind. Maybe the people who put the flag up, they just thought it looked pretty cool, or they thought that it maybe expressed identification with the just general history of their state or something. They weren't being racist, but still we can say, well, flying the flag is racist because it's part of this public system, right? Its symbols are public. Yeah, a single individual can't determine what a public symbol means. That's sort of determined by society as a whole, and so even if nobody involved in hoisting the flag is racist, we can still say that flying the flag still expresses racist attitudes. I mean, that's one plausible thing we might say. I think that's. I don't know. Some of this seems a bit strained to me, but the point here is that even this much doesn't seem to be the case for abortion and prenatal testing. I mean, we just can't apply the same kind of reasoning to selective abortion. Abortion and prenatal testing are just not part of any well-defined symbol systems. There's no general understanding of what is represented by getting a prenatal test or having an abortion. With something like the Confederate flag, I'm not sure that it always is racist to fly it. I think that I don't really have a problem with Confederate flags, but you can still see. Well, yeah, I mean, flags are kind of public, and there is a general understanding of what a flag expresses. And there is a kind of history of support for slavery with respect to the Confederacy and so on. But there just isn't anything like that when we look at abortion and prenatal testing for disabilities. There is no public symbol system here, so it really isn't clear in what way abortion could express meanings. It looks like it just isn't the kind of act that does express meanings in this sort of way, or so Nelson suggests. So that's the expressivist argument, and as we can see, there are a few problems with it. Now, the expressivist argument claims that selective abortion sends a discriminatory message to people with disabilities. A similar kind of argument claims that selective abortion sends a bad message to other children of the family. Leo Kitay suggests that to abort a fetus because it has a disability sends the message, and I quote, that the love my parents have for me is a condition of my being mentally and physically sound, not just of being a child of theirs. They love me because I am smart and fit. Kitay's worry is that selective abortion shows that the parents' love for their other children is merely conditional. It's conditional on them not having a disability. Essentially, it turns the family into a club where members are selected based on particular characteristics, with the implication, of course, that if a member loses those characteristics, they will no longer be part of the club. So the crucial point here is that when a woman chooses to abort a disabled fetus, this is in most cases a fetus that she previously wanted. So she has made a commitment to raising, to having this baby and to raising it. She wants to do what's best for it. So she might cut down on alcohol use, she might go to the appointments regularly, she makes sure to take precautions when doing work. She does various things to protect the child. Then a disability is discovered and she aborts it. She kills a child that she previously wanted and previously tried to protect simply because of its disability. Now, prima facie, this does seem to suggest that the commitment to her other children will be removed if those children become disabled. That's literally what's happened to the fetus, after all. The fetus is disabled, so the mother gives up on it. What does that mean for the children who have been born? Does that mean that if they become disabled, the mother will give up on them? So there's a worry then that selective abortion expresses a kind of problematic message to other members of the family. So we've already seen some ways of objecting to this kind of expressivist type argument, so I won't dwell on this, but just note that this is another way that you can run the expressivist argument. So a fourth argument is based on the claim that disabilities constitute separate cultures. Recall the example discussed earlier of deaf communities. These are communities of people, they've organised into close groups, they live together in the same place, they have their own language, sign language. Many of them may be activists for their political rights as a minority. So it does look pretty plausible to say that there is in some sense a deaf culture. Now, if the disabled are seen as a separate culture, well, that culture should be preserved, just like we respect and preserve other cultures. So with deaf people, interestingly, a number of deaf people were very critical of cochlear implants. These are devices that can restore or improve hearing. Their concern was that these devices would literally erode their culture. It would destroy their language, sign language, and it would remove any need for them to be organised into communities. Well, similarly, selective abortion can be seen as a direct threat to other cultures, and as therefore being morally problematic. There are several objections to this argument. First of all, it arguably makes raising a disabled child less appealing to prospective parents, since most parents don't want their children to become part of a different culture. Obviously you have to accept that a child isn't going to meet all your expectations, but I think it's reasonable for parents to want their children to be part of the same culture as they are. I do think there's a plausible response to this point, though, which is that a person can participate in more than one culture. A person can identify with both English culture and with Taiwanese culture if half your family is English and the other half is Taiwanese. Similarly, a person could identify with both the English culture and with the disabled culture. So it's not really clear to me that this is such a significant objection. A second objection is that, well, it's not really clear that we do or that we should try to preserve other cultures just in general. I mean, there are many cultural practices, certainly, that we try to stamp out. Many cultures are misogynistic or racist. Many cultures practice things like female circumcision that we think are very bad, and so on, and we try to stop that. Now, I mean, this is, of course, a massive debate in ethics. It would be kind of tangential to go into here, the question of to what extent we should try to respect or preserve other cultures, and then to what extent we should try to push our values onto other cultures. That's a big debate. But I just want to kind of flag up this argument. It because the claim that disabilities are separate cultures and should therefore be preserved seems to rest on the assumption that other cultures have to be protected and nurtured, which is open to debate. Finally, and I think most seriously, do most disabilities actually have separate cultures? I mean, perhaps there is a deaf culture, but is there a Down syndrome culture or a cystic fibrosis culture? I find that rather less plausible. Many people with disabilities don't organise into clearly structured communities in the way that some deaf people do. So even if we accept this argument, it's not clear that it would apply to many of the disorders that are screened in prenatal testing. Okay, a final argument is basically the attempt to draw an analogy to other kinds of selective abortion that many people do find objectionable. Consider sex selection. In India and China and various other countries, many women will selectively abort female fetuses, and this is leading to quite significant imbalances in the sex ratio. Now, most people's reaction to this is that this is morally wrong. It reinforces the oppression of women, the dehumanising of women, and so on. And I mean, in the longer term, because there are fewer and fewer women relative to men, that kind of sex ratio imbalance arguably is going to lead to more violence, more social strife. It also reduces women's political power because it makes there are less of them, so they're going to have less kind of force as a political bloc. There'll be less need to appeal to women. Politicians won't need to do that so much. So so in many ways, then this kind of imbalance in the sex ratio can be a problem. And I mean, it seems that selective abortion on the basis of sex is quite significantly questionable. Now, what justification might parents in these countries give for sex selection? Well, the obvious one is that females will cause problems for the family. Males are better both for the family's social status and for ensuring a secure financial situation. Females are less economically productive. I think in many of these countries, having the standard sort of cultural practice is that when men and women marry, the family of the bride, I think, have to pay for it. And generally speaking, also another general practice is that men will stay with their parents, right? So the men will stay with their parents and look after their parents when the parents get old, whereas women are, as it were, kind of given away to another family, and they will not look after their parents. So, certainly for the family, it's better to have a male. Right? They won't be paying for the wedding, and they will have somebody there to look after them when they get older. Another claim might be that abortion is actually kind of better for the child because females in these countries have harder lives. Females suffer a great deal of discrimination and often outright violence. I'm sure you've heard about the problems of rape and sexual assault in India. Females are not going to be paid as much for their work and so on. Now notice that these are exactly the same justifications that people use for aborting disabled fetuses. Right, so people assume that the disabled child will be a greater burden on the family, or will be unable to work productively, or will suffer a low quality of life. Indeed, one thing to consider is that on the social constructivist model of disability, it's probably the case that females in misogynistic cultures should be considered to be literally disabled. The social environment of these cultures is structured so as to exclude females from various aspects of life. As another example, consider homosexuality. Suppose that one day we discover that there are genes for homosexuality, and so we can test whether the fetus will grow up straight or gay. Again, most people would find aborting a fetus just because it has gay genes to be morally questionable. But, I mean, it's arguable that homosexuality is literally a disability. There is social stigma against homosexuals, lower rates of employment. In many places they have fewer legal rights, higher rates of suicide, rates of HIV are substantially higher in homosexual populations in the West. Now these problems result from social factors, but as noted earlier, disability in general is often caused by social factors. For various reasons to do with social discrimination, homosexuals in many places suffer from reduced opportunities. So arguably they are literally disabled on the social constructivist model. So the point is, if we think that it's acceptable to abort fetuses purely because they're disabled, then we should also think it's acceptable to abort fetuses purely because they are female or purely because they are homosexual. But that's a conclusion that many people would be a little unsure about, right? I mean, it does seem that aborting a fetus because it's female or because it's gay is at least, it's morally questionable at the very least. So we've seen a number of arguments against selective abortion. I'll end with a general objection to all of these arguments. If prenatal testing and selective abortion are morally problematic, what about other means of preventing disability? Women take folic acid to prevent spina bifida. They reduce alcohol intake to prevent fetal alcohol syndrome. If selective abortion against disability is wrong, are these practices also wrong? I mean, that seems absurd. And yet it does seem that many of the arguments that we've considered would apply to, for example, trying to prevent fetal alcohol syndrome by reducing alcohol intake. Now, of course, an obvious point here is that these things, so things like reducing alcohol intake, that involves protecting a particular fetus from harm. So the mother is committed to looking after this particular fetus, and she reduces alcohol intake to protect it. Abortion, on the other hand, doesn't protect it from harm, it simply kills it. But the point is, it's not obvious that this makes a difference, right? I mean, prima facie, many of the arguments that we have considered would seem to apply to preventative measures as well as to selective abortion. If you think through the arguments that we've looked at, it seems that they also apply to preventative measures. So, it seems that I don't think we would want to say that there's anything morally wrong with reducing alcohol intake during pregnancy. And so maybe that suggests that selective abortion is okay too. But anyway, that's all for today. So thanks for watching. Goodbye.